what I was thinking about looking at the shark nets as a human-wildlife conflict. And I've taken some steps towards that. And today I want to tell you a little bit about what I'm finding right at the beginning of the study. So I'm going to be talking about people's perceptions of the shark net specifically, not the general public, but of the people that are involved in the decision-making and the flow of information pertaining to bather protection in KZN. So in the middle of last century, between 1940 and 1960, sharks injured or killed 44 people in KZN, and that impacted not only the victims and their families, but also the tourism industry that many people rely on. And municipalities along our coast responded by setting shark nets, and that task has been taken over by our Sharks Board. They've been doing it for 50 years now. And sharks and other marine megafauna are caught in these nets, and most of them die. So this is a classic human-wildlife conflict, which has been defined as a situation where human lives and health are impacted, as well as the tourism livelihoods. And also sharks' lives and health are impacted. And then there's the collateral damage in terms of other marine megafauna and the impact of removing top predators from the ecosystem. So I'm busy working to try and understand this conflict and to improve the chances of managing it successfully. So the aim is for the general project is to map the conflict, but this particular presentation I'm going to be exploring key stakeholders' perceptions of the shark nets. So those are people that have a stake in the drivers and the consequences of preventing shark attack, like the beach manager at Mhlathuzi municipality. So I visited various stakeholders. I conducted semi-structured interviews face-to-face. I asked questions exploring the respondents' perceptions of the shark nets. We transcribed their responses, and then these data were analyzed qualitatively using discourse analysis, and we code for themes. So to give you an example of what this means, in response to my question, what are the pros of shark nets, I got answers such as, the biggest pro is the psychological advantage that tourists gain knowing that they are protected. Someone else said, it puts confidence into a person. Someone else said, it's more a psychological thing. So there's some barriers there to protect us, the bather, but whether it actually works, I don't know. And the last example is tourists' perception that they're protected. So from these responses, we pick out a theme of psychological reassurance. And we also note there's an additional theme about tourism. So what did we find here? I'm going to tell you about 15 different interviews with those that are most closely involved with the drivers and the consequences of protecting bathers from sharks. I have done another 10 with NGOs and other kinds of people, but this is all I'm going to tell you about today. So obviously the stakeholders of the Sharks Board, and then 3 tiers of government: the National Department of Environmental Affairs, the provincial government, including its entities, KZN Wildlife, TKZN. Technically, Sharks Board is also an entity. And then there's the local government, in this case, the Mhlathuzi municipality. I tried to interview people near the top of the hierarchy, as well as the people on the ground, and people that are scientific, as well as the ones that are more in a managerial role. So when I ask, how do you explain to others how the shark nets work? These are some of the examples of the responses that I got. So the nets work as a gill net fishery with the idea that less sharks in the water means less chance of someone encountering a shark, which means less chance of someone being bitten. Someone else said, it's not a barrier. Well, it's a barrier, but it's more of a fishing device, really. It doesn't keep sharks out necessarily. It just catches the big ones. Someone said, sharks won't go through the nets. And someone else said, the nets are in a line parallel to the beach, but there's nothing coming out and blocking it from the sides. And another person said, I just know they are there. So let me explain the table to you quickly, because this is where we code the responses. So you can see the themes that were coded in the main part of the table, and across the top you have where the respondents were from. Frequency down the right-hand side is the number of times it's the number of times a theme was mentioned. And you can see that, and you can see how many people are asked that question along the bottom. Each person can only be scored once for a theme, even if they've mentioned it more than one time. So what you might notice is that the Sharks Board and the biologists from KZN Wildlife and from National Department explained the nets as fishing devices. There were also respondents from each organisation, except Sharks Board, who perceived them as a physical barrier, though more often than not, they noted that the barrier is permeable to sharks. And there was a non-negligible number of people that admitted they weren't sure about how they work, or they talked around the issue without really answering a question. So the main thing to notice is that the people in the know explain them as fishing devices. When it came to the pros of the shark nets, I told you what people said in the methods. All of the organizations mentioned that the pros are the psychological reassurance that they provide to bathers, especially the tourists. When I asked about the cons of shark nets, I got some interesting results. One person said, animals are caught. This can impact the broader ecosystem. The shark nets are non-specific in their catch, and this is of concern to the Department of Environment. We don't want animals to be killed. Another response was they kill a lot of sharks. They kill a lot of bycatch, and you don't really know if they've prevented a lot of shark attacks. Someone else said, in terms of international contemporary best practices, it could be considered a very archaic way of dealing with perceived threats. And another person said, it costs us a lot of money, taxpayers' money. So there were a lot of themes for describing the cons, although the difference between some of the themes were very subtle. Everyone referred to the loss of marine life, generally or specifically. The deaths of sharks was regretted the most by most of the organizations. You might notice that there were nearly three themes per respondent, so it was quite complicated to tease out. So I tried to simplify it a bit, and I just looked at the first theme mentioned only, and still it comes out as important that the death of sharks is one of the major cons. And I'd say that previously I'd perceived a greater concern about the bycatch than the sharks, but maybe that's because it was general public that I'd spoken to in the past, whereas this is a more specialized set of people. Then the other question I asked was, if you could change one thing, what would you change? And I got responses like, if we came up with a way of keeping sharks and humans apart without killing sharks, I'd be very chuffed. There was a response that went, it would be better if we had technology to discover. We used bird scaring lines to scare the seabirds and reduce that bycatch. Someone said, I'd remove them. Someone said, I would recommend certain times when we really need protection, just the busy months, November to February. And someone said, I'd change people's perceptions about what the animal does. And so when we code themes out of these sorts of responses, we got that most representatives from most organizations said that they would change the method used to protect bathers. If you look down the theme column, you'll see that quite a few of them said they'd prefer there to be no nets, or that they'd scale back or prevent animals dying. Interestingly, more than one person said that they'd change people's perceptions. And one person said, I wouldn't change anything. And I think I anticipated more replies like that. But the main thing is that people are interested in alternative ways of doing this. Trust is often an issue in human-wildlife conflicts, and in my first few interviews, I asked respondents to rate their levels of trust of the Sharks Board and the other stakeholders that we were talking to and about. But it was actually rather an uncomfortable question, so I dropped it. But I learned something quite valuable from the first few times that I asked, and that's that levels of trust of Sharks Board were generally high. People said things like, they're the experts, and we use what they give us. So just doing some thoughts around what I've been finding so far and what those results imply. We know that the general public doesn't perceive the shark nets as fishing devices, but it's a little bit surprising that many of the people who are involved in the decision pathway or in supporting roles, they don't describe the nets as fishing gear. Yet everybody is aware of the fact that sharks die in the nets. So it's almost as if to some people the sharks themselves are bycatch. And I guess they haven't grasped or they haven't been made aware of the intentionality or the deliberate nature of the shark deaths. So when it comes to managing the human-wildlife conflict, one of the ways to overcome some of the potential barriers is to highlight the shared nature of the problem. So I think that our engagement with these organizations that are working with the drivers and the consequences of protecting bathers from shark attacks has been useful. The fact that there are so many of them that are interested in alternatives is encouraging, and hopefully this translates into support for the Sharks Board's shark repellent cable. So these are just the first steps in the mapping of the conflict, but making progress. And if there are any social scientists out there, and I'd love to chat to somebody about analyzing the data, because I'm a biologist and I'm just figuring out the social science part. So thank you very much for listening, and thanks to all my interviewees for their time and willingness to share, and thanks to our institutions and partners and to volunteers that helped with the transcription.